All right, here we are. Uh, About to read chapter 12. Once we read chapter 12, we're more than halfway through. There are only 23 chapters. This is Living with Art, the 11th edition by Mark Getlein, and I'm just reading it aloud for those who are taking my 4-week class and need to listen to this on their way to work or while doing other things. Um, I want to go ahead and apologize up front for mispronouncing all of the names and place names. Feel free to correct me in the description. I'm sorry, the comments down below. Also, I haven't said this yet, but if you are new to my YouTube channel, please subscribe. I've got a bunch of videos on art, and I think you'll like them. But anyway, I'm just reading aloud the arts. The Living with Art, chapter 12. Here we go. Chapter 12, Arts of Ritual and Daily Life. As we saw in Chapter 2, our modern concept of art took shape during the 18th century. It was then that European philosophers separated painting, sculpture, and architecture from other kinds of skilled making and placed them together with poetry and music in a new category called the fine arts. More than 2 centuries separate us from that moment. And over that time, the new grouping has come to seem natural to us, just part of the way the world is. Yet, in fact, the grouping is not natural, but cultural. In this chapter, we look at the context that art was lifted from, objects made with great skill and inventiveness, rewarding to contemplate and imbued with meaning. They were made to be touched, to be handled, to be used or worn in daily life or in ritual settings, such as religious ceremonies. Because of that, they possess a special human intimacy. Even if we see them now in a museum, we know that they once were used by their owners, who took them into their lives. We begin by introducing a range of widely used media: clay, glass, metal, wood, fiber, ivory, jade, and lacquer, illustrated with Western objects fashioned before our system of fine art arose, and with objects from cultures where that separation never occurred. We then look briefly at how Western thinking about these arts has changed and been challenged in the centuries since fine art was born. Clay. Ceramics from the ancient Greek world, keramakos, from the ancient Greek word keramakos, meaning of pottery, is the art of making objects from clay, a naturally occurring earth substance. When dry, clay has a powdery consistency. Mixed with mixed with water, it becomes plastic, that is, moldable and cohesive. In this form, it can be modeled, pinched, rolled, or shaped between the hands. Once a clay form has been built and permitted to dry, it will hold its shape, but it is very fragile. To ensure permanence, the form must be fired in a kiln at temperatures ranging from about 1,200 and 2,700 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. Firing changes the chemical composition of the clay so that it can never again be made plastic. Nearly every culture we know of has practiced ceramics. The earliest known ceramics are from China and have been dated to as early as 20,000 years ago. Pottery, almost as old, has been discovered at sites in Japan. A major requirement for most ceramic objects is that they be hollow, that they have thin walls around a hollow core. There are 2 reasons for this. First, many ceramic wares are meant to contain things, food or liquids, for instance. Second, a solid clay piece is difficult to fire and may very well explode in the kiln. To meet this need for hollowness, ceramics over the ages have developed specialized forming techniques. One such technique is called slab construction. The ceramist rolls out the clay into a sheet, very much like a baker would roll out a pie crust, and then allows the sheet to dry slightly. The sheet or slab can then be handled in many ways. It can be curled into a cylinder, draped over a mold to make a bowl shaped into a freeform sculptural configurations, or cut into shapes that can be pieced together. Another technique for making a thin, hollow form is coiling. The ceramist rolls out rope-like strands of clay and then coils them upon one another and joins them together. A vessel made from coils attached one atop the other will have a rigid surface, but the coils can be smoothed completely to produce a uniform, flat wall. The native peoples of the southwestern United States made extraordinary, large, finely shaped pots by coiling. During the 20th century, the tradition was revived by a few supremely talented individuals, including the famous Pueblo potter Maria Martinez. Martinez worked with the local red clay of New York. Martinez worked with the local red clay of New Mexico. The distinctive black tonalities of her finished pots were produced by the firing process. After building, smoothing, and air drying her pots, Martinez laboriously burnished them to a sheen with a smooth stone. Next, a design was painted on the slip liquid clay. Um, the pot was then fired. The pot was then fired. Partway through the firing, the flames were smothered and the pot blackened in the resulting smoke. Areas painted with slip remained matte, that is, dull, while burnished areas took on a high gloss. By far the fastest method of creating a hollow, rounded form is by means of the potter's wheel. Potters in the ancient Near East were using a rotating disc, today called a slow wheel, to speed the making of coil pots by around 4000 BCE. But the true potter's wheel, known as the fast wheel, seems to have been invented first in China a little over 1,000 years later. Despite some modern improvements and the addition of electricity, the basic principle of wheel construction remains the same as it was in ancient times. The wheel is a flat disc mounted on a vertical shaft, which can be made to turn rapidly either by electricity or by foot power. The ceramicist centers a mound of clay on the wheel, and as the wheel turns, uses the hands to open, lift, and shape the clay form, a procedure known as throwing. Throwing on the wheel always produces a rounded or cylindrical form, although the thrown pieces can later be reshaped, cut apart, or otherwise altered. A Chinese vase illustrated on the facing page would have been thrown on a wheel by a specialist at one of the great ceramic centers of Imperial China, where thousands of workers produced ceramics on an industrial scale using assembly line methods. The vase is made of porcelain, a ceramic made by mixing kaolin, a fine white clay, with finely ground pétons, also known as porcelain stone. When fired at high temperature, elements in the mixture fuse into a glassy substance, resulting in a hard, white, translucent ceramic. The secret of porcelain was discovered and perfected in China, and for hundreds of years potters elsewhere tried without success to duplicate it. After being shaped, the vase was dipped in glaze. Ceramic glaze consists of powdered materials in water. When fired, they fuse into a non-porous, glass-like coating that bonds with the clay. Glazes may be formulated so that they yield a color when fired, but the classic glaze for white porcelain was transparent. It was probably made chiefly from very fine ground pétons, an ingredient in the porcelain itself. After firing, the brilliant white vase was decorated with enamel colors, yet another Chinese invention. Made from mineral pigments mixed with powdered glass, enamels offered ceramic artists a broader palette than glazes alone could provide. The vase was then fired again at a lower temperature to fuse the enamel colors, which could not have withstood the high heat needed to fire the porcelain itself. The motif of 9 peaches with peach blossoms carried a symbolic meaning for Chinese viewers. Peaches were emblems of longevity, and peach blossoms were used to decorate for the new year. The number 9 was associated with the idea of eternity. All in all, the vase was auspicious, visually wishing its owner a long life of many years. Glass. If clay is one of the most versatile materials, glass is perhaps the most fascinating. Few people, when presented with a beautiful glass form, can resist holding it up to the light, watching how light changes its appearance from different angles. Although there were numerous formulas for glass, its principal ingredient is usually silica or sand. The addition of other materials can affect color, melting point, strength, and so on. When heated, glass becomes molten, and in that state it can be shaped by several different methods. Unlike clay, glass never changes chemically as it moves from a soft, workable state to a hard, rigid one. As glass cools, it hardens, but it can then be reheated and rendered molten again for further working. According to a legend recorded by ancient Roman author Pliny, the secret of making glass was discovered accidentally by seafaring Phoenician traders. Debarking from their ships on the eastern Mediterranean shore, the traders made a fire on the beach and set their cooking cauldrons over it on lumps of nitrum from their cargo. Nitrum was a valued substance that seems to have been either potash or soda. Potash or soda. The heat melted the nitrum, which fused with the sand to create a transparent liquid that cooled as glass. Delightful as the story is, archaeological evidence suggests that glass was first manufactured further inland, in the region today divided between eastern Syria and northern Iraq. From there, the technology spread throughout the ancient Near East, including Egypt, where this bottle in the shape of a pomegranate was made. The most familiar way of shaping a hollow glass vessel, such as a bottle, is by blowing. The glass artist dips up a mass of molten glass at the end of a long metal tube, and by blowing into the other end of the tube produces a glass bubble that can be shaped or cut while it is hot and malleable. The bottle here, however, was shaped by a more ancient method known as sand core casting. In that method, a core of compacted clay and sand was made in the shape of the cavity of the intended vessel. Wrapped in cloth and set in the end of a long rod, the core was plunged into a vat of molten glass, then removed for further work, such as smoothing and decoration. After the glass had cooled, the core was scraped out. Glass was a luxury product in the ancient world. This bottle probably held pomegranate juice, which was appreciated as a beverage and also used for medicinal purposes. A red fruit filled with hundreds of edible garnet-colored seeds, the pomegranate has been associated by many peoples with fertility and renewal. The ancient Egyptians were no exception, and they included pomegranates and images of pomegranates in their burials to help promote rebirth in the afterlife. This little bottle, then, would have taken part in a rich network of associations that gave it meaning beyond its humble function. A special branch of glasswork, stained glass, is a technique used for windows, lampshades, and similar structures that permit light to pass through. Stained glass is made by cutting sheets of glass in various colors into small pieces, then fitting the pieces together to form a pattern. Often the segments are joined by strips of lead, hence the term leaded stained glass. The 12th and 13th centuries in Europe were a golden age for stained glass, and the religious philosophy that guided the building of great cathedrals of that time. Light was viewed as a spiritually transforming substance. The soaring interiors of the new cathedrals were illuminated by hundreds of jewel-like windows, such as the one illustrated here from the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Chartres, France. The central motif in a branching tree that portrays the royal lineage of Mary, mother of Jesus. The tree springs from the loins of the biblical patriarch Jesse, depicted asleep at the base of the window. Growing upward, it enthrones in turn 4 kings of Judea, then Mary, then Jesus himself. Metal. Ever since humans learned to work metal, they have made splendid art, as well as functional tools from this versatile family of materials. One distinctive aspect of metal is that it is equally at home in the mundane and the sublime, the bridge that spans a river of the precious ring on a finger, the plow that turns up the earth, or the crown on a prince's head. Whatever the application, the base composition of the material is the same, and the methods of working it are similar. As discussed in Chapter 11, metal can be shaped by heating it to a liquid state and pouring it into a mold, a process known as casting. Another ancient metalwork technique is forging, in which metal is shaped by hammer blows. Some metals are heated to a high temperature before being worked with hammers, a technique known as hot forging. Iron, for example, is almost always hot forged. Other metals can be worked at room temperature, a technique known as cold forging. Gold is an example of a metal that can be forged cold. This pair of royal earrings from India testifies to the skills of early South Asian goldsmiths. The smooth, rectangular, bud-like forms were fashioned from hammered gold. The elaborate decoration is made of gold granules, minute spheres of gold applied in linear design, stylized leaf motifs visible on the earring to the right, a winged lion visible at left, and an elephant are worked in low relief on the broad surface of each earring. The two animals are worked in low relief on the broad surfaces of each earring. The two animals are royal emblems, suggesting that the earrings were probably a royal commission. The earrings are so heavy that they would have distended the earlobes and come to rest on his or her shoulders, as depictions of early Indian rulers and deities in sculpture make clear. We may recall as well that the iconography of the Buddha figure, which developed around the same time, includes distended earlobes, to remind us that in his youth he was a pampered Indian prince. The pair of earrings gives us a sense of the splendor he renounced. A lion appears symbolically again in this medieval European aquamanile, derived from the Latin for water and hand, manus. An aquamanile held water for ritual hand washing. Aquamaniles were used by priests who washed their hands at the altar before celebrating Mass, the central Roman Catholic rite of worship. They were also used in secular settings by aristocrats and wealthy merchants. Those dinner rituals included washing their hands in water perfumed with orange peel and herbs, often fashioned in the form of animals. The fanciful metal vessels seem to have been an Iranian invention. Certainly they were used for centuries in the Islamic world before passing into the Christian culture of medieval Europe. Modeled in wax and then cast in latten, an alloy of copper, like bronze and brass, the lion aquamile here stands just over a foot tall. Water would have flowed into a waiting basin for the spigot issuing from the mouth of the dragon's head and juts from the lion's chest. Another dragon rises up on the lion's back to serve as a handle for lifting the vessel. The lion was a popular motif for European aquamaniles, perhaps because its symbolism could be adapted to both religious and secular settings. In a religious context, the lion could symbolize Jesus Christ. It was also the symbol of St. Mark, one of the four gospel writers. In a secular context, the lion was a royal symbol suitable for the table of a noble family. Wood. Widely available, renewable, and relatively easy to work, wood has been used by almost all peoples across history to fashion objects for ritual or daily use. As an organic material, however, wood is vulnerable. Heat and cold can warp it. Water can cause it to rot. Fire will turn it to ash, and insects can eat away at it. We must assume that only a small fraction of the wooden objects made over the centuries have survived. The most common products of the woodworker's art is furniture. The basic forms of furniture are surprisingly ancient. The chair, for example, seems to have been developed in Egypt around 2600 BCE. Massive stones for rulers and humble stools for ordinary people had existed earlier, but the idea of a portable seat with a back and armrest was an innovation. Miraculously preserved by the dry desert climate of Egypt, this chair, one of the oldest known, shows that artistic attention was lavished on furniture from the very beginning. The chair's legs are carved as the legs and paws of a lion and an emblem of royal power. Within the open frames of the armrests are carved bouquets of papyrus flowers, a symbol of lower northern Egypt. The repetition of the papyrus motif is in numerous contexts across the centuries allowed scholars of Egyptian art to decipher its symbolic meaning. With the alumi bowl by the great Yoruba sculptor Aloe of Is, a contrast, much of the meaning is lost. In contrast, much of the meaning is lost. For some of the iconographic, I'll get it in a minute. For some of the iconographic elements are unique, and the original context in which the bowl was used is no longer known. Alumai is a Yoruba word meaning one who knows honor. It refers to the kneeling woman, Aloe, depicted holding the lidded bowl. She is a messenger of the spirits, and she kneels in respect and devotion. Alumai bowls were common in Yoruba culture. Often they were used to store kola nuts, which were offered to guests as a sign of hospitality and to deities during worship. Of the many alumai bowls to have come down to us, however, only this one includes a kneeling nude male among the small figures supporting the bowl, and only this one features 4 women dancing in a circle on the lid. Both subjects are unprecedented in Yoruba art. If we knew who had commissioned the bowl of Aloe, or what context the bowl was used in, or what visual materials Aloe had been inspired by, we might be able to recover the meaning of these unusual elements, or better explain their presence. As it is, we can only marvel at the mastery displayed in the carving itself. The lid is carved from a single piece of wood. Even more astonishing, the base, including the bowl, the alumai, and the supporting figures, is also carved from a single piece. Aloe permitted himself a further Baruva touch by carving a freely rolling head inside the cage formed by the supporting figures beneath the bowl. This too was an innovation, and its meaning is likewise unclear. Again, there is a sidebar here, which I'm not going to read, but I imagine that some of the questions are from it. So feel free to read those. Please read those. Fiber. A fiber is a pliable thread-like strand. Almost all naturally occurring fibers are either animal or vegetable in origin. Animal fibers include silk, wool, and the hair of such animals as alpacas and goats. Vegetable fibers include cotton, flax, raffia, sisal, rushes, and various grasses. Fibers lend themselves to a variety of techniques and uses. Some can be spun into yarn and woven into textiles. Others can be pressed into felt or twisted into rope or string. Still others can be plaited to create baskets and basket-like structures such as hats. The art of basketry is highly valued by many Native American peoples, including the Pomo, whose ancestral lands are present-day California. Legend tells us when a Pomo ancestor stole the sun from the gods to light the dark earth, he hung it aloft in a basket that moved across the sky. The daily journey of the sun reenacts that original event. Pomo baskets are thus linked to larger ideas about the universe and about the transfer of knowledge from gods to humans at the beginning of the world. Traditionally, a woman's art, basket weaving, began with the harvesting of the materials. This activity, too, was endowed with ritual significance, for it involved following ancestral paths into the landscape to find the traditional roots, barks, woods, rushes, and grasses. In the basket here, willow and bracket fern root were used to produce a pattern of alternating lights and darks. Feathers, clamshell beads, and glass beads procured through the trade are woven into the surface. Somewhere in the basket, the weaver included a small, barely noticeable imperfection called a dowel. It serves as a spirit door, letting benevolent spirits into the basket and allowing evil ones to leave. Feather baskets are produced as gifts for important or honored persons, and they were usually destroyed in mourning when the person died. Textile is the fiber art we are most intimately familiar with, for we clothe ourselves in it. The very first textiles were probably produced by felting, a technique in which fibers are matted and pressed together. Another ancient technique still in use today is weaving. Weaving involves placing two sets of parallel fibers at right angles to each other and interlacing one set through the other in an up and down movement, generally on a loom or frame. One set of fibers is held taut. This is called the warp. The other set, known as the weft or woof, is interwoven through the warp to make a textile. Nearly all textiles, including those used for our clothing, are made by some variation of this process. The ancient Incas, whose civilization flourished in the mountains of Peru during the 15th century, held textiles in such high regard that they draped gold and silver statues of their deities with fine cloth offerings. Textiles were also accepted as payment for taxes, for they were considered a form of wealth. Standardized patterns and colors on Incan tunics instantly signaled the wearer's ethnicity and social status. Woven around 1500, the fascinating royal tunic illustrated here is a virtual catalog of such patterns, although scholars have not yet succeeded in identifying them all. The black and white checkered board pattern, for example, represents the Inca military uniform in miniature. By wearing this tunic, the king visually declared his dominance over all Incan society. Islamic cultures have focused a great deal of aesthetic attention on carpets and rugs. Among the most famous Islamic textiles is the pair of immense rugs known as the Ardable carpets, of which we illustrate the one in the collection of London's Victoria and Albert Museum. Like most Islamic carpets, they were created by knotting individual tufts of wool onto a woven ground. The labor was minute and time-consuming. The London Ardable carpet has over 300 knots per square inch, over 12 million knots in all. The design featured a central sunburst medallion with 16 radiating pendants. Two mosque lamps, one larger than the other, extend from the medallion as well. Quarter segments of the medallion design appear in the corners of the rug. These elements seem to float over a deep blue ground, densely patterned with flowers, making the carpet a sort of stylized garden. In a similar figure of speech, we talk of a field of springtime as being carpeted in flowers. Paradise in Islam is imagined as a garden, and such flower-strewn carpets represent a luxurious, domesticated reminder of this ideal world to come. Ivory, jade, and lacquer. A porcelain vase, a glass beaker, and a wool tunic might have been made as luxury items or intended for social elite, but the materials they were made of, sand, clay, animal hair, were common enough. With ivory, jade, and lacquer we arrive at rarer materials. Ivory and jade have been considered precious in themselves. Lacquer is unique to East Asia, where it has been the basis of an important artistic tradition for some 3,000 years. Technically, ivory may refer to the teeth and tusks of a number of large mammals. In practice, it is elephant tusks that have been the most widely sought after and treasured form. Today considered an endangered species, Asian elephants once ranged from the coast of Iran through the Indian subcontinent, southern China, and Southeast Asia. African elephants once roamed much of the continent south of the Sahara Desert. Trade in elephant tusks arose in the ancient times and continued unchecked well into the 20th century, bringing raw ivory to cultures that did not have local access to it. Today, the ivory trade in India is banned. The trade in Africa is restricted, monitored, and periodically suspended. Ivory was treasured not only by cultures that obtained it through trade, but also by cultures for whom elephants were a living presence. Many African peoples associated elephants symbolically with rulers, for they were seen to be mighty, powerful, wise, and long lived. The Yoruba city of O in present day Nigeria, only the king or titled chiefs would have been permitted to wear the armlet illustrated here. Carved from a single piece of ivory, it consisted of two interlocking cylinders. The inner cylinder is finely pierced in an airy open work pattern and punctuated by human heads carved in high relief. They may represent people over whom the wearer had power. The outer cylinder, which can shift slightly to the left or right, depicts kneeling hunchbacks, monkeys on leashes, and interlocking circles of crocodiles biting the heads of mudfish. Hunchbacks were associated with the deity Abatala, who had fashioned human bodies. He is said to have created hunchbacks while drunk, and he is thus their patron. Crocodiles and mudfish were royal symbols that linked rulers to Olokun, the deity of the sea who brought wealth and fertility. Scholars have suggested that such richly symbolic ornaments were worn at the festival of Os, which celebrated the origin of Yoruba civilization. Jade is a common name for two minerals, nephrite and jadeite, ranging in color from white through shades of brown and green. The two stones are found principally in East and Central Asia and Central America. Although their underlying structure differs, they share the extreme hardness, the ice-cold touch, and the mesmerizing translucent beauty that have caused jade to be treasured in cultures lucky enough to have access to it. The ancient Olmecs used jade figures of a shaman we looked at in chapter 2, prized green jade. They associated its color with plant life, especially with corn, their most important crop, and its translucence with rainwater, on which agricultural bounty depended. In China, jade of all colors has been prized and carved for some 6,000 years. In early Chinese belief, the stone was credited with magical properties. Again, here is a sidebar. I'm not reading the sidebars, just reading the chapter. You should definitely go back and read the sidebars. Among the oldest and most mysterious jade objects from China are the square tubes called Kong, decorated along their four corners with a repeating linear pattern that sometimes includes a mask motif. The tubes were a particular specialty of the Liangzhu culture, a late Neolithic culture that flourished in the Yangtze River Valley in eastern China. Kong were ritual objects, that much is clear, and they were included in great numbers in elite burials, usually in association with bai, flat jade discs with a circular hole at the center. Later, Chinese writers associated bai with the dome of heaven and Kong with earth, but we do not know what they meant to the people of the Liangzhu culture, which vanished suddenly long before the earliest Chinese dynasties. Lacquer is made up of the sap of a tree that originally grew only in China. Harvested, purified, colored with dyes and brushes in thin coats over wood, the sap hardens into a smooth glass-like coating. The technique demands great patience, for up to 30 coats of lacquer are needed to build up a substantial layer, and each must dry thoroughly before the next one can be applied. Ancient Chinese artisans used lacquer to create trays, bowls, storage jars, and other wares that were lightweight and delicate looking, yet water resistant and airtight. exported along with other luxury goods over the long overland trade route known as the Silk Road. Chinese lacquerware was admired as far away as the Roman Empire. Knowledge of lacquer spread early from China to Korea and Japan, as did cultivation of the sap producing tree. Asian artists developed a variety of techniques for decorating lacquerware. In China, a favorite method was to apply layer after layer of red lacquer, building up a surface thick enough to be carved in relief. The scene carved on the lid of the lacquer box, illustrated here, depicts two men meeting on a terrace overlooking a lake. They are attended by servants, one of whom enters through a pair of doors set in the arch of a large rock formation. In the sky beneath scrolling clouds, a crane flies near a tall pine tree. Before the symbols of longevity, as are the large mushrooms, both are symbols of longevity, as are the large mushrooms growing at the lower left. The search for longevity and even immortality is a central concern of Taoism, an ancient Chinese philosophy that became a sort of popular religion. Taoist immortals were believed to dwell in the mountain paradise that was entered through a grotto. The arrangement of rocks with their doorway here may allude to it. One legendary immortal was carried off to heaven on the back of a white crane. The elderly man holding a curved scepter may be a Taoist sage and his visitor a disciple hoping to learn the secrets of immortality. Perhaps one day the crane will swoop down from the sky for him. In Japan, artists perfected the art of decorating lacquerware with inlays of mother of pearl and sparklings of gold and silver powder. The writing box illustrated here features a motif of maple leaves, much like the ones that Ernst Haas captured in his photograph of a park bench in Kyoto. The leaves are scattered around a bugaku hat, a hat worn in traditional court dances performed by members of the aristocracy. For a cultivated Japanese audience, the combination would bring to mind a famous episode from the tale of Genji, a classic work of Japanese literature in which the young, radiantly handsome prince Genji dances before the emperor and his court as autumn leaves fall around him. As its name suggests, a writing box housed a set of writing implements. The inside, often decorated as well, was typically configured to hold an inkstone, an inkstick, brushes, a water dropper, a small knife, and an inkstick holder. Art, craft, and design. When painting and sculpture were placed in a new category of fine art, the skilled activities they were formerly associated with, textiles, ceramics, metalwork, furniture making, and so on, were grouped together under various names, each of which suggests a contrast with fine art. They were referred to as decorative arts, suggesting that they were primarily ornamental; applied arts, suggesting that they were fundamentally utilitarian; and even minor arts, suggesting that they were inherently less important. The English language offered up another word, craft, which, like the word art, originally meant skill. During the same historical period, the Industrial Revolution was transforming Western societies. The handmade world, which had existed since the beginning of human culture, was giving way to a world in which many objects used in daily life were mass produced by machines. Small workshops were being replaced by large factories, and the nature of work itself being transformed. Many social thinkers of the 19th century criticized those developments, and their criticism of industrialization went hand in hand with their criticism of the new distinction between fine art and craft. They pointed to the loss of dignity and of pride in one's work that factory labor entailed. They objected to the glorification of the fine arts over crafts, and to the lower esteem in which people who worked with their hands were now held. They mourned the loss of satisfaction to be had in making things by hand, and the pleasure experienced in using them, and they worried about the effect it would have on the human spirit. Criticism was especially strong in England, where the Industrial Revolution had begun. As the century wore on, many people grew determined to carve out a place for handmade objects in the new industrial order. They set up workshops and studios. They taught themselves and one another such skills as pottery, bookbinding, furniture making, and weaving. They held exhibits and formed societies, most famously in 1887, the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society. The arts and crafts movement, as it came to be known, quickly spread throughout Europe and to the United States, where its most vocal proponent was Gustav Stickley. In 1901, Stickley began to publish an influential magazine called The Craftsman, which introduced the ideals of the arts and crafts movement to a broad public. Several years later, he founded the Craftsman Workshop, where the hexagonal library table illustrated here was built. Made of American oak, its simple lines, forthright construction, and unadorned surfaces epitomized the style that Stickley favored for what he called a democratic art. The arts and crafts movement began to wane after a few decades, but its influence can be felt to this day. One of its legacies is the vibrant presence of studio crafts in our cultural life. Independent artists who practice such skills as woodworking, glass blowing, and weaving. An example is glass artist Toots Zinsky, whose Night Street Chaos we illustrate here. After many years of experimenting with more traditional blowing and molding techniques, Zinsky turned to working with glass threads, long filaments pulled from heated rods of colored glass. To create a vessel such as Night Street Chaos, she first layers glass threads in a flat, circular formation. She fuses the arrangement in a kiln, then slumps it into a bowl-shaped steel mold. The glass is reheated and remolded several times, with each mold a little deeper and rounder than the one before. The final shaping Zinsky performs by hand, pushing and pulling the symmetry of the molded vessel to create a sinuous, improvised, irregular form. Zinsky does not intend for her vessels to function as containers. The only thing they contain is my sort of fantasies and dreams, she has said. Rather, we might think of them as sculptural meditations on the beauty of vessels themselves, which have been the focus of so much aesthetic attention over the course of human history. Jeroen Verhoeven enlisted the help of computer-aided design and manufacturing technology to create Cinderella, a curvaceous table made of plywood. Cinderella was inspired by the forms of 17th and 18th century Dutch furniture. Verhoeven researched and drew examples after example, simplifying their contours. He scanned his drawings into a computer and fused them using 3D morphing software to create a hybrid form, an elegant table turning into a bulbous cabinet. Like an enchantment in a fairy tale, the virtual design is digitally sliced like a loaf of bread into 57 slices, which were cut and shaped individually by computer-driven working machines, then glued together and finished by hand. Verhoeven issued Cinderella in a limited edition, as artists do for prints and cast sculptures. For me, it's a manifesto, Verhoeven said about his creation. It's about showing what our high-tech tools would be capable of if they were fully utilized. We have at our disposal the most fantastic slaves whose possibilities we are completely wasting. We use them to mass-produce boring objects, whereas in fact these tools of the 21st century could produce art. Just like Cinderella, who is much more than a cleaning woman, but whose talents remained hidden because they weren't used. Another legacy of the arts and crafts movement has been a recurrent questioning of the distinction between fine art and craft. Beginning in the 1960s, many artists working with craft media began to claim a piece in the fine art world. Many artists working in the fine art system reached out to use materials and forms associated with crafts. In doing so, they have insisted that we think harder about just what, if anything, distinguishes one category from the other, and they have built bridges of understanding to other cultures where such a division never arose. Perhaps it should not surprise us that potters were among the first to practice their craft as an art. Clay, after all, had long led a double life, used at once for sculpture and for ceramics. Danish ceramist Marit Rasmussen uses the traditional coiling technique to build non-representational sculptural forms in stoneware. Red twisted form illustrates her special fascination with continuous surfaces. A single flowing ribbon with no beginning and no end. Red twisted form curls around itself, opening up negative spaces, delighting in the play between convex and concave surfaces, inviting us to take a visual ride on its roller coaster. I work with the idea of a composition in 3 dimensions seeking balance and harmony, Rasmussen writes. The finished forms should have energy, enthusiasm, and a sense of purpose. Ceramics had a comparatively easy time finding a place in the system of fine art, for clay had a long history as a sculptural medium. Fiber, on the other hand, faced greater resistance. The path was clearer in Europe, where the tradition of collaboration between artists and tapestry workshops had been kept alive. For more about tapestry, see Chapter 7. During the 1960s, exhibitions of contemporary tapestry, including increasing numbers of ambitious large-scale works in fiber by independent artists. Much of the new work abandoned tapestry's centuries-old link with painting. Many, from rough, natural fibers and using such techniques as knotting, braiding, and crochet, it demanded to be understood as sculpture. Among many artists working with fiber today is the young Brazilian Maria Nepomuceno, who used colorful rope and beaded necklaces of construct quirky. Let me try that again. Among the many artists working with fiber today is the young Brazilian Maria Nepomuceno, who uses colorful rope and beaded necklaces to construct quirky biomorphic forms. Arranged on the floor as though they had propagated themselves there, they suggest a colony of brilliant anemones in a tropical coral reef. Certainly sensuous and uninhibited, their craters filled with beads like eggs or spawn, they overlap and touch and send out exploratory tendrils toward one another. Nepomuceno's art was profoundly influenced by the experience of giving birth. She has compared the rope she works with to an umbilical cord through which she nourishes new life. The present connects the future. She builds her forms by coiling the rope in spirals, a movement she associates with whirlpools, galaxies, and the DNA spiral of life itself. She speaks of the beads of fertile points capable of multiplying themselves into infinity. Themes of fertility and generation are clearly present in Untitled. Even if we can't put a name to these creatures, we know what they are up to. In works such as Sasa, contemporary Ghanaian artist El Anatsu takes his formal inspiration from textiles. Then the material he works with is not fiber but metal. Sasa is made of bottle caps and small food tins such as sardine cans, flattened and then stitched together with copper wire. It recycles materials imported into Africa, goods that flow from wealthier places into a poor continent. In its visual splendor, Sasa draws on the tradition of African royal textiles such as kente. Kente, too, was an art of recycling, for it was originally made of silk, fabric imported from China. African weavers patiently separated the silk fabric into threads, which they then rewove in patterns that express their own culture. With Sasa, El Anatsu works even greater magic, for he transforms trash into something opulent and uses the materials of poverty to evoke riches. Made of pieces of colored glass fused and shaped in a kiln, the horse mask by Choctaw artist Marcus Ammerman also presents us with a transformation. Masks were one component of the armor that Indians of the American West formerly dressed their horses in before battle. The spread of firearms rendered this armor obsolete. Made of animal hides, it could protect a horse's flank against arrows but not bullets. Masks, however, were never abandoned, for their purpose was not so much physical as mystical. Made of buffalo hide, animal skins, and cloth ornamented with eagle feathers, animal horns, and symbolic motifs, horse masks served to intimidate the enemy and channel fearsome spirit powers, especially those of the Thunderbird, a sky deity whose merest glance produced bolts of lightning. The triangles that ring the eye holes of Ammerman's glass creation can be found on many traditional horse masks, where they symbolize lightning flashes from the horse's eyes. As we have seen, the arts and crafts movement heightened public awareness of the value of handmade objects and traditional skills in the face of industrialization. Yet most of the movement's leading voices fully recognized the value of mass production and making goods available to a greater number of people at affordable prices, and they appreciated the ability of the machines to facilitate dull, repetitive tasks. In Austria and Germany especially, the idea of the movement were interpreted to encourage cooperation between artists and manufacturers. In this new relationship, an artist's task was no longer to make an object, but to design an object that could be made by industrial methods. Writing in The Craftsman, Gustav Stickley referred to such objects as industrial art. Within a few years, the field had become known as design. One task of designers is to translate technological and scientific advances into functional, approachable, visually rewarding objects for our lives. A fascinating example of design at the forward edge of technology is Fractal MGX, a coffee table created by the design firm Wörtel Oberfell in collaboration with Matthias Bar and manufactured by MGX, the manufacturing division of a Belgian technology company. The designers took their inspiration from the Sukatra dragon tree, whose branches repeatedly divide in two until they are dense enough to support an umbrella-like canopy of leaves overhead. This growth pattern is one of numerous patterns in nature that approximate fractals, fragmenting geometric shapes that can be split into parts, each of which is a reduced version of the whole, a property known as self-similarity. Working with a computer-aided design, CAD, the team used algorithms to generate a similar structure of faceted branches and divide repeatedly in four at decreasing intervals, eventually becoming so small and numerous that they form a quasi-surface. As the designers explain it, the structure starts out in a disorganized state at the base. As it rises, it becomes increasingly organized until it ends in a regular grid, thus enacting a progression from an approximate fractal, like the tree, to a fractal with exact self-similarity. Even without knowing all the details, we can sense that the design is somehow both organic and mathematical, a sort of petrified geometric forest. Fractal MGX was not constructed, carved, or molded. Rather, it was printed using stereolithography, a computer-driven 3D printing technology that employs an ultraviolet laser beam to cure and bond layer after ultra-thin layer of light-sensitive liquid resin. Imagine a rectangular tank as deep as Fractal MGX is high. The tank houses a metal platform that can shift up and down. The printing begins with the platform at surface level. A blade sweeps over it, coating it with a layer of liquid resin just 4/1000ths of an inch thick. A laser beam plays rapidly over the resin, drawing the first micro layer of the design, in this case the four shapes that the branching table will grow from. These shapes harden, the rest of the resin remains liquid. The platform shifts downward 4/1000th of an inch, another coating of resin is spread, and again the layer dances over it, this time drawing the second micro layer and bonding it to the first. Fractal MGX takes between 7 and 10 days to print. When it is finished, the platform returns to the surface and the table rises up out of the pool of leftover liquid resin. After drying, it is cleaned, further hardened in an ultraviolet oven, and placed in a pigment bath for a day to tint it brown. Fractal MGX has been welcomed into the permanent collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, and the Victoria Albert Museum in London. The presence of design and craft objects in our museums is a final legacy of arts and crafts movement, ensuring that the category of art remains open to question and that it never floats too free of the objects that bring visual delight to our daily lives. Fractal MGX is pretty awesome looking, and I would love to have that in my house so I can sit on it. That is the end of chapter 12. Please go through and read the sidebars and look at the pictures and all of that. I do believe that you can now take a quiz on chapters 11 and 12, and chapter 13 is a quiz all by itself, I think. Anyway, actually it might be time for the midterm exam after you take chapter 12, read chapter 12. Can't quite remember. Anyway, that's it. Thanks for listening. Stay tuned for chapter 13. I'll try and read it tomorrow.